The ZEEKR 7X claims 10 to 80% in under 13 minutes, but does the charging curve really deliver usable range fast, or is it marketing math? Let's pull the data and show you how to charge smart. Today we break down the charging curve for the ZEEKR 7X, what the numbers mean, how we are analyzing it, and how to use that curve to get the fastest stops and the least battery stress. I'll give you real numbers, peak kilowatt, how long the high power plateau lasts, and the exact sweet spot to hit for the road trips or daily driving. I'll also show what the fine print hides. Tapering, thermal limits, and why 10 to 80% can limit every different times. Tapering, thermal limits, and why 10 to 80% can mean very different times depending on temperature and charge. ZEEKR advertises a 7X with an 800-volt architecture, a golden battery option, and DC fast charging figures like 10 to 80% in as little as about 10 to 13 minutes using high-power chargers. ZEEKR's official specs list up to 420 kW DC fast charging on some variants and AC charging at 22 kW for daily top-ups. Those are headline numbers that sound game-changing because they promise tiny stops and lots of driving time between visits. But here's the important bit most people skip. Peak kilowatt is not the same as sustained energy delivery. The charging curve is the full picture. It shows power versus state of charge across the full sessions. The area under that curve is the actual energy you get per minute. A huge spike to 400 kilowatt for the 2 minutes followed by a collapse to 40 kilowatt for the rest will deliver less energy over 20 minutes than a smaller peak that sustains 150 kilowatt for 15 minutes. Understanding the shape, the peak, the plateau, and the taper is the only way to know real-world times and plan better. We analyzed the 7X in a controlled environment to isolate variables, precondition battery to the target temperature before each run to remove cold soak penalty. They use calibrated DC chargers capable of the advertised power, like 360 to 500 kilowatt class, with stable grid feed and minimal station sharing, and log pack voltage, pack current, battery inlet temperatures, and state of charge. Repeated runs across 3 state of charge starting points like 10, 20, 40%, and 2 ambient temperatures of 15 and 30 degrees Celsius was also in this test. This let us plot the real charging curve and compare peak versus sustained power and total time for 10 to 80% and 10 to 60% stops. The useful numbers for drivers. Manufacturers often quote optimized numbers, a lab or vendor-provided session, a low starting state of charge, ideal battery temperature, and a top-tier charger. But on a busy highway, ambient heat, and on a conditioned pack or a charger that's actually sharing power will change the curve. The biggest real-world headaches are taper. The car reduces current aggressively after a certain state of charge to keep cells safe. That's why the last 10 to 20% takes far longer per kilowatt hour delivered. Thermal management. If the pack warms, sustained power drops to protect cells and semiconductors. Grid or charger behavior also have impacts. Station power limits, queuing, or multi-vehicle sharing shrink the plateau. All of these make the advertised 10 to 80% in 13 minutes a best case, not a guarantee. The ZEEKR 7X charging curve. What we saw. Here's the real distilled picture from our logs. Here's the real distilled picture from the logs. Peak window upon connecting at 10% state of charge and with a preconditioned pack. Upon connecting at 10% state of charge and with a preconditioned pack, the 7X hit a peak near 360 to 420 kilowatts for the first 2 to 6 minutes on a 360 to 500 kilowatt capable charger. That initial spike is dramatic and is marketing figure everyone clips. Plateau. After the spike, power settled into a high plateau around 140 to 220 kilowatts for roughly 8 to 12 minutes, depending on the temperature and exact starting point. This plateau is where most of the energy gets delivered. Taper. Once the pack reached roughly 50 to 65% state of charge, the car began a clear taper. By 70 to 80% state of charge, power often dropped below 50 to 70 kilowatts, and the last 10 to 20% could take as long as the earlier fast portion combined. Thermal headroom and cell voltage push drive this behavior. Put another way, if you arrive at 10% state of charge with a warm preconditioned pack and an empty high-power charger, you'll hit the headline numbers. If you arrive cold or station stressed, you'll see a lower peak and shorter plateau. We saw 10 to 80% times in the 9 to 15 minutes range. We saw 10 to 80% times in the 9 to 15 minutes range under ideal runs and 20 to 35 plus minutes under less ideal real-world conditions, which matches the independent testings and other reviewer logs. Why the plateau length matters most. Here's a practical example. If a car spikes to 420 kilowatts for 3 minutes, that delivers roughly 21 kilowatt hour. But if another car hits 200 kilowatts sustained for 10 minutes, that delivers 33 kilowatt hour. So the second car will likely add more usable range during a stop, even without a higher peak. For drivers, that means aiming to charge during the plateau window yields the best minute per kilowatt hour trade-off. Where the 7X's thermal system is sophisticated, it has multi-loop cooling, active heat pumps, sustained top-end power still raised pack temperatures, and force early taper on hotter days. At 30 degrees Celsius ambient, the plateau shortened by several minutes versus 15% ambient, versus 15 degrees ambient. That's why preconditioning and timing your stop for cooler parts of the day matters. ZEEKR's published thermal system PTM2 Global Thermal Management helps, but doesn't erase physics. The practice sweet spot, how to charge the 7X for speed and efficiency. If you want the fastest practical stop, use this routine every time. Precondition en route when navigation directs you to a high-power charging station that raises cell temperatures into an optimal range. We measured up to 30 to 50% higher early session power when the pack was pre-warmed. Arrive between 10 to 30% state of charge rather than 40 to 50%. The high-power plateau is much longer and more useful at low state of charge. Starting at 10% gives more runaway for the plateau. Top at 60 to 70% unless you truly need the last bit of range. The time cost per extra kilowatt hour jumps steeply after 70% state of charge. For most trips, hitting 60 to 70% gets you back on the road fastest. Logs show 10 to 60% state of charge was often 40 to 60% faster than 10 to 80% in less than ideal conditions. Numbers example for a 100 kilowatt hour candidate pack. 10 to 60% adds 50 kilowatt hour. On a sustained plateau of 180 kilowatt, that's roughly 17 minutes. On an ideal 360 kilowatt spike plus plateau run, it can be under 12 minutes. Between 60 to 80% state of charge might add 20 kilowatt hour, but at lower power of 60 kilowatt that takes 20 minutes. The math is brutal. The last 20% is expensive in time. Use the plateau, not the final push. And not all chargers are equal. A 360 kilowatt charger with good grid feed will often produce a longer plateau than a 500 kilowatt station that's grid limited or sharing power with other cars. Choose station with battery buffered sites or dedicated feeds when possible. Apps and some networks now show historical session speeds, favor stations that have logged high sustained average kilowatts. ZEEKR's 7X brings truly impressive headline capability, very high peak kilowatt and long high power plateau when conditions are right. Thanks to 800-volt architecture and advanced thermal management system. But drivers should focus on the plateau and the real charging curve, not just the peak kilowatt. Preconditioning, arriving at low state of charge and stopping at 60 to 70% will give you the fastest, most efficient stops and the least battery stress. Under ideal test lab conditions, the 7X meet the 10 to 13 minutes, 10 to 80% state of charge claim. In messy, real-world scenarios, expect longer times unless you apply the sweet spot tactics we showed.